So hey again, everybody. So this Beatle thing, when's it going to end? While we're at it, what about vinyl records in general? See, I saw something on the VC Facebook page that somebody had posted an article that says record company executives call the vinyl resurgence a fad, talking about the main record labels, which I think there's only like two or three left now because they've all consolidated, but that sales have increased in recent years of vinyl that had been probably in the 90s and late 80s. In the 90s, it probably been down there about 1 or 2, 3% of the total sales, and now they're up to 6 or 8%. And I've seen these articles about increased sales in vinyl records over the last 5 or so years. Of course, Record Store Day probably plays a part in that and all. And but the big record companies are saying, well, it's 6% or whatever of total sales is really not worth bothering with, and it's a fad, and it's the hipster kids, and it'll go away in time soon enough. And everybody, well, not everybody, but several people got kind of indignant on the posts on VC there, saying they don't know what they're talking about and all. Uh, well, I mean, I think at 6%, it obviously vinyl is not going to ever return to being what it was in the 70s and 80s, where it accounted for, I guess, what probably 80-90% of all music sales, with the rest of the stuff filling in with cassettes and 8 tracks and reel to reel. And then, of course, when the CD came along, vinyl was supposed to be that's it, kind of the way of the Betamax and the VCR. Of course, it didn't, and I'm sure that some of the interest in vinyl is because it's the thing to do these last few years. So I mean, there's probably a lot of bandwagon jumpers that are going to lose interest in the next you know few years or so. I've always bought records even through the CD age. I did slow down, but I mean, I always bought records and always liked records. Actually preferred them to CDs in a lot of ways. But I think there'll be people buying vinyl records. But what do you think? If is vinyl just a fad, and is it going to actually finally go the way of the dinosaur, as was predicted back in mid '80s when CDs came along? Or because you do see a lot of younger people on the VC. You do see a lot of younger people in line at Record Store Day things, or if I go out to Docks or Record Town, I'll see teenagers and college kids. But you got to think that's that group of kids. But here's the whole group of kids that are 10 to 25 now, and of that group of kids that buys music, the vast majority, I'm sure, aren't buying vinyl records. They're probably buying MP3s or streaming or whatever kids do nowadays. So, just kind of what's your thoughts on this whole vinyl resurgence? And while we're at it, brings up the Beatles. I was thinking, just quick little story. Back in 1995, the anthology came out on TV, and they released the 3 discs, or they released the first CD of the 3 sets. And I was at Borders Bookstore because by 1995, most of the old record stores in Fort Worth were long gone, unfortunately. You still had Record Town. I went there sometime. You didn't have Docs, hadn't come along yet. And in the 90s, you had all these crappy kind of used CD stores, and I never really liked those because most of the CDs in there weren't used. They were new, and they were overpriced. And as far as what was used in there, it was the pickings were slim. I guess kind of hit or miss. Sometimes you might get lucky, but most of the time it was just a bunch of junk. It's like here's a solo album by the bass player from Foghat, or here's Barry Manilow's Christmas album, stuff that, pretty much kind of like when you go to Goodwill now and see a bunch of stuff that's there because nobody wants it. Anyway, so about really the only place to get, and the internet was there, but it was still new enough that eBay and Amazon wasn't really a factor yet, at least for me. And so the place to get records, and that was mainly CDs, not vinyl. You had half price books, you could get used vinyl, but a place to get new music or buy new CDs was Borders Bookstore. So I was in Borders Bookstore, and I knew the anthology thing was coming up, and I saw a sign that said that they Anthology Volume 1 was being released Tuesday of a week ahead, a week from now or 2 weeks from then. And so the store was usually open, I think, 10 or 11 o'clock. They were going to stay open till into the next day to 1 a.m. so that they, Monday and into 1 a.m. on Tuesday, so that they could sell the anthology starting at midnight. It's kind of a Be the First on Your Block to own the new Beatles album. And there's a little advertiser poster in the store that said this, and said they were going to have a band playing Beatles music, have some trivia contests, costume contests, raffle drawings, and all the other Beatles CDs 10% off or whatever. Sounded kind of fun. I thought, well, that's right up my alley. I'll go to this. So I went and I was driving out, and I mean, I didn't really give it a lot of thought, but I was kind of thinking, well, I wonder, who else is going to be there, if it's going to be like maybe 20 or 30 other people besides myself. And as thought, well, maybe probably be people like my age and older, because like I've said on here a bunch of times, I was born in '63, so I was around when the Beatles were around, but I was a little bitty kid, and I didn't get into them till I was probably about 8 or 9, even though I remember hearing them somewhat. My brother's playing them. But so I figured it'd be like my age, and then people that were 5, 10, 15 years older than me that were actually old enough to, when the Beatles were around, be aware of it. And so I got there to the store, and it wasn't 20 or 30 people. It was probably 200 to 300 people, which surprised me. The other thing that surprised me was there were people my age, there were people older, but there were a whole bunch of people. In 1995, I think I was like 30, 31 or 32, depending on if this was before or after September. So there were a bunch of people there that were 10, 12, 15, 18, like younger people, and not just like one or two of them, but quite a few of them. And they're running around with their Beatles shirts and stuff, and they're, waiting to get their anthology CD, and some of them even dressed up for the costume contest, and they had a raffle. Like I said, they had several of them, and they gave away these different prizes, and one of them they gave you a ticket, and they would every 30 minutes or so they'd call out a ticket number. So this one girl, and I guess looked like she was about 12 or 13. She won, and she got a like a black and white poster of Paul McCartney from probably about 65, 66. Well, she gets the poster. She goes over to her 3 or 4 friends. They're all about the same age, and they unroll the poster. She unrolls it to show it to them, and they're jumping up and down and screaming. And you're thinking like, man, because these kids were probably born like, I don't know, 1982 or something, 10, 12 years after the Beatles broke up, and they're jumping around, and it's like, you wouldn't think it's 1995. You'd think you're in the parking lot of Shea Stadium back in '65 or something, and they're getting ready to. So it kind of continues, and then you see people here that are pretty young talking about Beatles, and not just Beatles, but Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Rolling Stones, Beatles, and stuff. And you're thinking, because those kids that were 12 or something in 1995, they're what, close to 30 or whatever now. But you see people on here that are teenagers. So the other thing was, someone told me they had read an article, or they just mentioned it to me, that the old movie stars like Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford and things like that, people like that, a lot of those old movie posters from the early days, and Chaplin started making movies, I think, in like 1915, and kind of his made movies up. Last movie was in the 60s, but his real movie making time and glory days were from like 1915 up through the 30s. And you got to think that at one point Charlie Chaplin was Beatle famous. He was one of the most famous people in the world. But and those other actors too, Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, and stuff like that. So a lot of these old movie posters from the early days, the 19-teens, the 1920s, are worth a fortune. They're in the $10,000-$20,000 range or more. And the article, the guy that told me about this, the point of the article was, well, yeah, but as time goes on, those people get further into the past, and will those things be worth $20,000 5, 10, 20, 30 years from now? Because will there be, for something to be worth It's not like I'm buying $20,000 movie posters anyway, but I mean, whoever buys them. But I mean, for something to be worth that kind of money, your economics class, supply and demand, somebody has to want it and be willing to pay that price for it. And if nobody's willing to pay that price for it, you know, so as it gets further and further out, I don't know that the point was that people are going to largely forget Charlie Chaplin and people like that, or if maybe not forget, but have heard of them, but not really care one way or another. So those things will no longer be worth what they are now. Same thing with the Beatles, and the Beatles seem to have, well, and I remember, it seems to me that like back in the old days, kids liked their music, and then the next set of kids came along and they liked their music, and the music before them they weren't that interested in. That was like old timey stuff, and then at some point it became like in the 80s or so, maybe, I don't know when, that all of a sudden everybody, or a lot of people, like music now, music then, music 20 years ago. So that's why the Beatles and the Led Zeppelin and Rolling Stones and all that are still hugely popular with a lot of people that weren't even born when the bands were around. But is that going to go on forever, I guess, is my question. Um, because Charlie Chaplin was way before my time. My grandmother used to talk about him. She liked him. I kind of like him and watched his movies, I guess, maybe become hearing my grandmother talk about him. I don't know. But, he was making his big movies way before I was born. And I think he died in 76. I mean, I was alive when he was still around. But he wasn't making movies in the 70s and all. So, and I mean, a lot of those old ragtime and 20s music has been largely forgotten. You don't really see that talked about on the VC. Uh, Occasionally, Bobby Gass has some tastes in music that go pretty far back, and a few other people. And obviously, I understand that the media was not in the 20s and the 19 teens the way it was even in the 60s and 70s, let alone today. You didn't have internet and all that like we have now, but even in the 60s and 70s, you had TV and promotion and stuff that was of a more refined or higher level, or different level at least, than it was in the 40s and the 20s and stuff. So a lot of those old musicians and music of the 20s and teens has been largely forgotten. The Beatles and a lot of the other bands like that, the Clash, the Doors, the Pink Floyd, still seem to find new fans every year, people that discover them that were, like I said, not around when they were active. And but you wonder, will the Beatles and those other bands, will that just continue forever? Because I think the Beatles, 50, 100 years, 25 years, I don't know about 10 years, but 25, 50, 100 years from now, I think they'll certainly be remembered. They'll be in history books and stuff, or rock and roll, Elvis and the Beatles and all. But will they? Because I mean, we're not getting any younger. Uh, but will 12 and 15 and 16-year-old kids 50 years from now be excited about finding a first pressing of Rubber Soul, or any pressing of Rubber Soul, or Sgt. Pepper, or Physical Graffiti, or Waiting for the Sun? Or will they in time become like you know Bessie Smith and the Ragtime, Jelly Roll Morton and those guys, or Big Bill Broonzy, that just sort of names in a history book, or that was what my grandparents listened to, or maybe forgotten? Because I mean, sure, there's a lot of music from the 20s and the 30s that's, you got the big names, and then you got the sort of middle of the road names, and a lot of them have probably been all but forgotten, except for the most intensive music fans that enjoys that period. And most of those people are probably passed on. So yeah, like I said, I don't see a lot of people my age or younger talking about the 30s too much on here. And I just wonder, do you think that's going to happen with the Beatles and the other big bands in time? And if so, when? Or do you think that 100 years from now, there'll still be kids going ape over the Beatles and the Doors and the Clash and them. And same with the records. Do you think that this vinyl album resurgence is a fad, something that'll be 2 years from now, people will move on to something else and it'll largely be forgotten, or do you think it's going to stick around for a while? And just any thoughts on that, I guess, if you feel like weighing in?